Okay, welcome back. I hope that was a useful activity for you. You were able to practice some of those learning progression ideas in creating activities and objectives. I hope looking through our course book was useful to see how I have used this in my own planning for this course. And I'm excited to hear how you might use this in your own classroom, and also how you have already been using this, how this has already been useful for you. If this is something you've studied before, please do share that with us as a group. I'd love to hear how you have found it helpful in the classroom. But now we're going to shift gears. We are going to be talking this session about cognitive preferences. And there are 3 terms that you might see used for this, and I noticed that one of them actually in your course book I didn't change, so you'll see that in there as well. But the term we're going to use is cognitive preferences. So cognitive being the way you think, preferences being your mode of choice. And this will all make sense as we dive into what cognitive preferences are. But the other 2 terms you might see are multiple intelligences, and this is the term that was used by the psychologist who started this field of study, and also learning styles. And that was as it became more applicable to the classroom, people started using the term learning styles. That's a fine term to use. I would just encourage you to think about this topic as cognitive preferences, only because with learning styles, we might tend to narrow in on one over the other, whereas when we use the term cognitive preferences, it helps us to see that there can be a varied response or a varied choice among people, and especially one person could have multiple preferences. We might be more prone to pigeonhole people if we use the term learning styles. So that's the only reason. There's nothing wrong with the term learning styles, but that's why we're going to use cognitive preferences in our lecture today. As we get started, if you would please pull out page 26, we are going to do an activity right now that I wanted to introduce you to. You may or may not have done this before. You may have used this in your classroom, or maybe it'll be new, but I wanted to introduce this to you. Remember, my goal in this course is to offer you hopefully information, but also activities that will be useful in your classroom. So last week we did the free write activity, and then this week we are going to do a KWL chart. And again, I wish I were there so I could say how many of you have used a KWL chart in your classroom. But if you've heard of this, great, you'll be a good demonstration for the others. And if you haven't, then no worries, we're going to jump into it right now. So this KWL chart, you'll see at the top of page 26. And it is, all that it is a blank piece of paper with 3 columns. In the first one, you're going to put a K. The second one, you're going to put a W. And the third one, you're going to put an L. Now, this is an activity that you could use with your students whenever you're starting a new unit or a new topic in the classroom. It can be really useful, helping to engage the students and also to give you feedback as a teacher as to what your students already know or don't know. Something we need to always keep in mind as teachers, and I think it can, at least for me, it can get easy to overlook, is that if I have my lesson plan, I'm going to teach this information regardless of whether or not my students already know it. But if my students already know this information, I'm not really teaching them anything. I've tried to kind of share that with thinking with you, mentioning you might already know this or you might have already studied this. And if that's true, I'm still going to give you the information, but maybe I can give you another way to think about it or another way to apply it. So that's kind of how I've tried to acknowledge this truth that if you already know this information, I'm not teaching you something new. So this is a good feedback tool to help us know whether or not we need to spend time on something that we anticipated spending time on. So the KWL chart. When you get ready to start a new unit or topic, you will have your students work together to fill out a chart. You can do it individually. I have you doing it individually today. You could do it as a class, a classroom-wide activity, or you could have people work on it in small groups. In the K box, you want the students to list everything they already know about the topic you are about to study. So whatever that is, if it's a word, if it's a sentence, they should write down what they already know about this topic. In the W box, you want the students to write down any questions that they have or things they want to know, things they want to learn about this topic. Already, I hope you can see how this would be really useful. Like I said, with that K box, your students might already know something that you had planned to teach them, and you don't need to spend quite so much time on it when you get to it in the lecture. At the same time, your students will be far more engaged, and a lot of you talked about this in your essays, about students being engaged when they see connections to their life. When you wrote your essay for me, your teaching manifesto last week. So this time, if we know what our students want to know and we're able to incorporate that into our teaching, you will find your students far more engaged because there is a personal reward to the lectures or the teaching or the class for them because they were able to contribute something they wanted to learn and then see the reward of that by learning it in the classroom. So you will be able to engage with your students really well if you use this W column and you are able to incorporate some of those things they want to know into the material. The L box you will leave empty right now and in the future if you use this in your classroom. That is a box you'll come back to at the end of the unit and students will list what they've learned. So K, what do I know about this? W, what do I want to learn about this? And L, what did I learn about this? So good feedback tool, it's a good structure just to help you see the information going on in the classroom. And we are going to I'm going to give you 5 minutes, talk with the person next to you. I don't want you all moving around, we're not going to report this back. I just want you to go ahead and take 5 minutes. This is the place where I used the term multiple intelligences, but multiple intelligences or cognitive preferences, what do you know about that? And what do you want to learn about that? So 5 minutes, I will play some music for you as you talk with your partner and jot down some notes, and then we'll come back and talk about them in a minute. could see all of your charts right now, but I can't. So if you would like to take a picture with your phone and send that to me on email or upload it to the classroom, if you've gotten into the classroom, go ahead and do that after class tonight. I'd love to see your thoughts and what you've included on that chart. Do you think this would be a helpful, useful activity in your classroom? Why or why not? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. But right now we're going to jump into cognitive preferences. And I used this activity now because it's going to fit in really well with one of the cognitive preferences we talk about in a few minutes. And do you remember the activity at the beginning of class that I told you to keep in your mind? The competition to see who could remember the most things from each screen. That's going to come back in this lesson as well. So hold tight. Let's talk about cognitive preferences and then start working through some of this information. So what are cognitive preferences? Well, this is the understanding that each person exhibits intelligence and potential differently. This field of study was started by a man named Dr. Howard Gardner in the 1930s. He was a professor of education at Harvard University, and he was a psychologist. And he studied the fact that each individual does not learn or perform well in the same way. So he started studying what are the different ways that people best learn and best fulfill their potential. We're going to go through the 8 that he has outlined as the core cognitive preferences or multiple intelligences. We're going to go through those in a couple of minutes. He has a list of criteria as to what makes these different preferences valid, but we're not going to go through that tonight. It's not helpful for our purposes. So Howard Gardner started this. He identified 8 primary ways that students possess, acquire, and demonstrate knowledge. And I'm sure you can think about this right now with your own class. Think of a handful of students who all have different skills and abilities. And each of them are capable of performing what is needed to perform as a student, but they might exhibit that differently. This is really important for us as educators to keep in mind, especially when we think about problem students or difficult students in our class. I think often our problem students or our difficult students have an intelligence that might be different than the average in your class, or it might be different than what easily learns and performs well in school. And I think often they feel insecure and unconfident because of that, and they either begin acting out to gain attention in a different way or to shield themselves because they feel like they're unable to perform, or they close themselves off and they don't do anything in the classroom because they're embarrassed or they feel like they will never measure up. Now, this is not the only reason to study these preferences, but this is one thing I want you to think about. Think about the student in your class who's underperforming right now. And as we talk about these cognitive preferences, think if you can see maybe a bent towards one or the other that you hadn't noticed before, and that maybe this could really help that student perform better if you found a way to help them in their own preference. A quote that has always helped me as I think through this, and one thing that I just love remembering when I think about multiple intelligences is the quote, "Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid." And that is a quote from Albert Einstein, who we all know was a genius, and yet if you've heard much of Einstein's story, he definitely had struggles in school, and he went up against a lot of opposition because he didn't fit the mold. So as we think through this tonight, you probably have a lot of students in your class who are doing well, and that's great, and I'm glad for that. But I want you especially to think about those students who might be a little bit on the outside, and think of how knowing these facts about our students can help us better serve them. So let's think through these intelligences or these preferences, and we're going to go through all 8 of them, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we can use this in our classroom, and then I'm going to give you an activity to do, and then we'll be done for the night. All right, so there are 8 intelligences, and so the other thing I want you to think of is some of them align with the activity at the beginning of the class tonight when I had you thinking through, or when I had you listing the things you saw on the screen. And I wonder if some of you were really good at screen 1 and not so good at screen 2, or vice versa. Or if some of you were really good at screen 3 but really struggled with screen 1. Did you notice that among any of you? Were any of you especially good at one screen over the other? Well, that might give us a hint to your cognitive preference. That might show us how you best learn, memorize, take in knowledge, and use it in the classroom activity. Okay, so let's walk through these 8 intelligences or 8 preferences. The first one is musical. You're music smart. I wonder if any of you feel like maybe this might be how you best learn and demonstrate knowledge. But some of the things you can do in your classroom for your music smart students would be to do songs or chants. Take the facts that you're learning and put them into a song form. Assign that as an activity for the students to take this table of information and create a song and then perform it in front of the class. That will really help those students who are musically smart in your classroom to perform well. The second one is bodily kinesthetic. Bodily kinesthetic, and that is body smart. These are students who learn well as they're doing movement and connecting things. So you want to do things like role plays or acting, getting students to put together a demonstration of something and then getting in front of the class and moving. Screen number 3 in our activity before, it had things like jump, sleep, write an essay, eat a mango. I was trying to assess those of you who might be kinesthetic. I know you weren't actually moving, but in order to remember those words, I wonder how many of you kind of felt the actions in your body. So those are people who are bodily kinesthetic intelligent, have a bodily kinesthetic intelligence or preference. The third one is interpersonal, and this is people smart. Right? This is people who work really well in groups, who are able to pick up on what's going on with others, they're able to interact well, and they learn well in a group setting. So you might do things like group work or surveys where your students go and ask people information, and they're able to interact with people as part of their knowledge acquiring or knowledge acquisition and demonstration. Okay, so that's interpersonal. Next, we have verbal linguistic, and this is word smart. So people who are really good at writing, or people who are very good at expressing themselves in an essay or a speech. You might have them write essays or stories to process the information that they're learning. They might take the facts that you've given them in class and turn them into a story or a persuasive essay. They might write instructions for something. These are verbal linguistic smart people, word smart people. Number 5 is logical mathematical, and this is logic smart. So somebody who likes to work through things, reason things, they enjoy math and numbers and puzzles. So you might have them outline the steps of something that happens. You might give them a problem or a a scenario and have them outline the steps they would take. You might have them write proofs. If you are especially teaching math, this is where we've learned about proofs, but even in science or history, you might have them outline the facts or the proofs to make something true. Number 6 is naturalistic, and this is nature smart. This is someone who really enjoys the outdoors, who is very in tune with nature around them. And you might have them find similarities between what you're studying and something in nature. So you might have them create a metaphor. Look at something, a plant or a phenomenon we can observe in nature, and have them make connections to the history lesson that you're making or the English class that you have that day. Have them make connections. And another great thing for these students is to get outside. I don't know what opportunities you have for that, but when these students are outside and they're able to be surrounded by fresh air and trees, it's especially helpful for them. They're able to process things well because they're very connected with nature. The 7th one is intrapersonal. Right, so we talked a couple minutes ago about interpersonal. This is intrapersonal, and this is self-smart. This is someone who's very analytical, who's very introspective. They see themselves and they are able to connect how they interact with the world around them. So something you might want to do with these students is to journal or to list how it affects them. You might, for a history class, you might have them connect how that history lesson affects them or write themselves into the story. For a science class, you could have them think through how this particular lesson impacts their everyday life. Right? These are the things we've been talking about that align with our goals, but it really reaches that student's need in the moment of learning. And the last one is the visual spatial. This is somebody who is picture smart, and they're very good with images. This is why we did that KWL activity, because these students, these visual spatial, are very good with graphs and diagrams. So you might want to find more ways to bring graphs into the classroom or have them draw pictures. If screen number 1 was easy for you in our game at the beginning, you might be a visual spatial learner who can see pictures and remember it. I know for me, this is probably my top preference. When I was a student, I used to have pages of notes with all kinds of pictures and illustrations drawn all over them, because for me, when I went to take an exam, I could repicture all of those images, and it helped me really remember what I'd studied. So for me, this is a preference that stands out because I think it's one that I gravitate towards. I also love putting things into graphs, whether that's a table like the KWL chart or a Klein where you have like, I love this, I like this, I don't like this, and you rate something along that Klein. That can be really useful for visual spatial students to remember and acquire information. You can make it any qualifiers can go on either side, and then they have to rate how things go. So if you're doing literature analysis, you might have something about the story and whether that was positive character traits or negative character traits, and then they have to mark where the different actors or characters in the story fall on that line. This is just these are tools that really help visual spatial students. Now, what am I asking you to do with this information? Am I asking you to have 20 activities for each class period to make sure that you're accommodating each preference? Well, no, that's not realistic. You're not going to be able to have an activity for each learning preference every class period. What I am asking you to do is to start to think how you can check each one off as you work through a unit. You're going to have an extended amount of time with your class on each topic, And is there a way that you can incorporate each of these preferences into your teaching, and in that way to serve all of your students, regardless of whether or not it's the common learning preference or if they're maybe the only one? And again, part of the reason we're calling this a cognitive preference is because it's what you gravitate towards, it's what you enjoy the most, but all of us can learn in all of these ways. Some of them might be very difficult for us, and some of them might be easy for us, but we all can learn in some of these ways. So I would say for me, the interpersonal one was difficult for me as a student before. Now, as an adult, it has gotten easier to learn in a group setting, but that one, as a high schooler, was difficult for me. So if I had a teacher who only ever did group work, I would really struggle in a class like that. I also was not necessarily very keen on bodily kinesthetic, so getting up and acting was difficult for me. It was nerve-wracking, and it's not that I couldn't learn, but it wasn't my preferred method of learning, and so defenses would go up. I would not be as teachable or as receptive to the teaching because I was tense or nervous about the activities. But when the teachers incorporated some of those visual spatial activities or mathematical activities, I felt like I was able to perform better. So the more activities that we can incorporate, the better chance we have of accommodating every student in our class. So that's one thing I want you to think about. The other thing is that problem student that you thought about earlier when I talked about difficult students. Have you been able to think about what their preference might be? I think maybe we often see students who have a musical preference, and to us it's annoying because we see that demonstrated in drumming in class or humming or calling out for attention through song. But have you thought about maybe that student would perform really well if I gave them some musical activities to help them learn this information? So that's the other way I want you to think about it. One, how can you best serve all of your students by incorporating these activities for each of these preferences into each unit? And then also, how can I help one particular student who might need a little extra support by helping them figure out their preference? And then even if you give them personalized activities to help them grow, give them a boost of confidence, help them to see that they really are capable of learning and performing if they can find the best way for them to learn and perform. And I wonder about all of you. Do you know what your learning preference or your cognitive preference is? Have you thought of it throughout this lecture of the way that you best learn and best perform in the classroom? I hope that was helpful for you to think about. So we're going to go ahead and stop there. We have one more activity that I want you to go ahead and do with the people around you. I've given you a couple of classroom topics, and I want you to come up with activities for the different preferences for each of those topics. So you'll see that on page 27. And I would just want you, there's a couple of questions to think about and then this activity to do together. And then as you finish that, we will come back, we'll conclude for the evening, and I will send you on your way and see you again next week. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to write them on that feedback form or email me directly about that. All right, I'll see you in a couple minutes.